Ethan Carter had always believed that a home was more than four walls and a roof. It was a sanctuary carved out of history, sweat, and dreams. A decorated military veteran turned local city official, Ethan had earned his respect through service and integrity. Today, his quiet suburban home stood as both a retreat and a living testament to his commitment to community and craftsmanship. Nestled on a generous plot of land on the outskirts of town was his prized possession, an old barn that had been in his family for generations. With its weathered red siding and a roof that whispered stories of years gone by, the barn was a symbol of legacy, hard work, and the promise of tomorrow. Every weekend, when the sun cast golden hues over the sprawling fields, Ethan could be found restoring vintage farm equipment or simply savoring the gentle hum of life around his property. It was a place where memories mingled with the laughter of neighbors, where every creaking floorboard and every worn beam held a tale of resilience. But for Ethan, it was more than nostalgia. It was a beacon of hope that showed him the beauty of simplicity. However, not everyone in the neighborhood shared Ethan's reverence for heritage and personal liberty. At the center of the brewing storm was Kerren, the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association HOA rules. As the HOA president and an emblem of entitlement, Kerren wielded her authority with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. To her, the community was less about preserving memories and more about enforcing conformity. With a crisp blouse, perfectly coiffed hair, and a permanent expression of superiority, she had made it her mission to micromanage every aspect of neighborhood life. Kerren's disdain for anything that deviated from her narrow view of community perfection was legendary. She had already targeted several neighbors for minor infractions, whether it was a mismatched mailbox or a hint of a wildflower in an unkempt garden. Nothing escaped her critical eye. Her latest obsession was Ethan's barn. It doesn't fit our aesthetic, she would argue, declaring that the rustic charm was nothing more than a blemish on an otherwise pristine community image. But for Ethan, that barn was an irreplaceable piece of his history. The tension finally broke one crisp autumn morning. Ethan was out in his barn sanding a worn beam when he noticed a dark figure striding up the gravel path. There, with an air of unassailable authority, stood Kerren, flanked by a couple of stern-faced HOA board members. Clutching a folder filled with alleged infractions, Kerren's voice rang out with a mixture of condescension and command. "Ethan Carter, you are in violation of several community standards, starting with that barn of yours. It's an eyesore and a relic that threatens our neighborhood's reputation." Ethan, tool in hand and brow furrowed, met her gaze with calm defiance. "My barn isn't a relic. It's a reminder of where I come from. And I don't see any rules that say I can't keep a piece of my history alive," he replied, his tone even but resolute. Kerren's eyes narrowed, her smile twisting into something less benign. "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Carter," she snapped. "Our community standards aren't up for debate. Either you conform or you face the consequences." Her words were accompanied by a gesture that implied both threat and inevitability. That first confrontation set the stage for what would soon escalate into a battle of wills. Ethan could already sense that Kerren's motives were steeped more in personal vendetta and entitlement than in any genuine desire to maintain order. The HOA, under her leadership, was less a collective effort to improve the community and more a platform for Kerren's personal crusade against anyone who dared to challenge her vision. As the day wore on, Ethan returned to the barn, his mind swirling with frustration and determination. He knew that the barn, with all its creaks and scars, was his safe haven. Kerren's interference was more than just a nuisance. It was an affront to his identity and the legacy of his forefathers. In that quiet moment, amidst the soft clatter of falling sawdust, Ethan vowed silently that he would not let Kerren's overreach strip him of what was rightfully his. He resolved to defend his property, his history, and the freedom to live on his own terms. Little did he know, this initial standoff was only the spark that would ignite a full-blown war between an entitled, overzealous HOA and a determined man willing to risk everything to keep his past intact. The stage was set for a conflict that would shake the very foundations of the community, a battle where rules, personal honor, and the sanctity of home would clash in a dramatic showdown. The morning after the confrontation, Ethan awoke to a sight that made his heart sink. A thick envelope, sealed with the official insignia of the HOA, was taped to his front door. Inside lay a notice, an official fine of $750, accusing him of breaching community aesthetic standards and disrupting the visual harmony of the neighborhood. The words on the paper were as cold and unyielding as the concrete sidewalks that wound around his property. Outside, Kerren was already on the scene, standing with a smug expression as if she had just unveiled a masterstroke. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she called out, her tone dripping with condescension. "I trust you received the notice. It's not a suggestion, it's an order. The rules apply equally to everyone, and I expect you to comply immediately." Ethan's heart pounded as he read the fine. It was not merely the monetary penalty that stung, but the blatant abuse of power behind it. As a city official well-versed in local laws, he knew that the HOA had no legitimate claim over a property's historical artifacts or its sentimental value. The fine was nothing more than an overreach, a power move designed to humiliate and coerce. Refusing to be intimidated, Ethan took a deep breath and responded firmly. "I understand your concerns, Kerren, but this fine is baseless. I'm well aware of my rights, and I intend to challenge this violation through the proper channels." His voice, calm yet resolute, echoed the certainty of a man who had seen bureaucratic overreach before and wasn't about to let it stand. Kerren's response was immediate. "You may think you're above the rules, but actions have consequences," she said, her voice rising in a crescendo of entitlement. "If you don't pay up or fix your property, the HOA will escalate this matter, and I'm prepared to call inspectors. The city will have no choice but to intervene." Her eyes flashed dangerously as she added, "I expect full compliance, Mr. Carter." True to her word, the following day brought an unanticipated barrage of HOA power. A fleet of inspectors appeared on Ethan's property, clipboards in hand, as if summoned by an unseen force. Neighbors, caught in the middle of this unfolding drama, whispered nervously about fines, regulations, and the seemingly endless reach of the HOA. While Ethan tried to explain that the rules were being misapplied, Kerren's presence loomed large over every conversation. Determined not to back down, Ethan visited the local zoning office to file a formal complaint against the HOA's arbitrary enforcement. There, he meticulously documented the series of fines and warnings issued against him, each one a calculated attempt to wear him down. His evidence, drawn from community records and first-hand testimonies, painted a picture of a crooked system rigged to favor Kerren's personal vendetta over genuine community interests. Throughout the day, Kerren paraded around with the air of a triumphant general, certain that her power play had cornered Ethan. Every step she took was punctuated by the rustle of official documents and the clack of her high heels, a stark contrast to Ethan's quiet defiance. "The rules are not suggestions," she would reiterate to anyone who would listen, as if her words alone could enforce the law. By dusk, the pressure on Ethan had mounted to a fever pitch. The inspectors had documented a series of alleged violations, and the HOA had begun circulating anonymous complaints about his property. It was as if Kerren had orchestrated a campaign to isolate him, to make it appear that his barn was a threat not only to aesthetics, but to community order itself. Yet, despite the mounting challenges, Ethan's resolve only grew stronger. In the silence of his study that night, surrounded by stacks of municipal guidelines and legal texts, Ethan realized that this was no longer just about a barn. It was a battle against a system that allowed entitled individuals to misuse power for personal gain. The fine was just the first domino in what promised to be a relentless chain of conflicts, and he knew that he must stand firm if he was to protect not only his property, but also the integrity of the community. Kerren's first power move had set in motion a series of events that would soon turn the once peaceful neighborhood into a war zone of bureaucratic skullduggery and personal vendettas. And while the fine might have seemed like a small sum to some, for Ethan it symbolized a fight for truth and fairness, a battle he was determined to win, no matter the cost. The next segments continue in the same spirit. Ethan begins to detect a pattern behind the HOA's actions. Rumors swirl among the neighbors about other homeowners who have faced similar treatment, and whispers of corruption become impossible to ignore. One breezy afternoon, while Ethan was tending to his beloved barn, a discreet knock on his door revealed an unexpected ally, a sympathetic board member who wished to remain anonymous. "Ethan," the board member confided in a hushed tone, "I have seen how Kerren manipulates the rules. She's been marking violations that never existed and redirecting funds to her personal accounts. You must document everything." The revelation struck Ethan like a thunderclap. With his experience in service and leadership, he immediately began to set up discreet cameras around his property, focusing especially on the barn and the porch, areas that Kerren had repeatedly targeted with her accusations. Armed with newfound determination and the anonymous tip, Ethan combed through old HOA meeting minutes and financial records. Every document he uncovered hinted at a larger scheme. Kerren was using the power of the HOA as a smokescreen to funnel money and exert control over the neighborhood. The fines, the warnings, even the seemingly random inspections, all of them were part of a carefully orchestrated plan designed to silence dissent and force compliance. The next board meeting, held in the sterile atmosphere of the community center, became the stage for Ethan's first real public challenge to Kerren's authority. As the meeting commenced, the room was thick with tension. Homeowners sat on the edge of their seats, aware that the confrontation was long overdue. Ethan, with a file full of documented evidence in hand, walked up to the podium. His voice was steady, each word deliberate. "I have here records of fines that were issued without basis, receipts for funds that were never used for community benefit, and accounts of inspections that violated our own local laws. This is not about aesthetics. This is corruption." Kerren's eyes flared with indignation. "Mr. Carter, these are unfounded accusations," she snapped, waving her own stack of documents, as if they were talismans of authority. "The rules are clear, and the inspections were lawful." But as Ethan proceeded to lay out his findings, one by one, murmurs of approval and shock rippled through the crowd. Even some of the more reserved board members began to exchange uncertain glances. The confrontation escalated when Ethan detailed how fines mysteriously disappeared from the official accounts whenever certain donations were made, a fact that pointed squarely at personal enrichment. His evidence was painstaking, backed up by affidavits from neighbors who had silently suffered under Kerren's heavy-handed enforcement. The room, once dominated by Kerren's smug assurance, was now charged with the energy of an awakened community. Throughout the meeting, Kerren's protests grew more desperate. She attempted to dismiss the evidence as misinterpretations and exaggerations, but the tide had turned. A board member, emboldened by the mounting revelations, leaned forward and remarked quietly, "Perhaps it's time we re-examine our leadership and practices." The seed of doubt had been planted. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had begun as a routine enforcement of arbitrary rules had transformed into an exposé of deep-seated corruption. Ethan's calm persistence and thorough documentation not only laid bare Kerren's misdeeds, but also emboldened many of the homeowners to question the legitimacy of the HOA's practices. That night, as Ethan reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras, he felt a bittersweet victory. The confrontation had put him in the crosshairs of Kerren's wrath, but it had also united the community against a common enemy. Even as the threat of further retaliation loomed, Ethan knew that the truth was on his side, and that the slow crumble of the HOA's corrupt power structure had already begun. In the weeks that followed, whispers of change began to echo through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once cowered under Kerren's authority started speaking up about their own experiences. The pattern was undeniable. Kerren was no longer merely an overzealous enforcer. She was a symbol of entitlement run amok. And now, with evidence in hand and a community beginning to stand together, Ethan's counterattack was gaining momentum. The conflict reached a fever pitch when, one early morning, Ethan awoke to the sight of heavy machinery in his driveway. The HOA, acting on Kerren's latest edict, had begun to tear up his property in the name of community improvement. Without warning, a tow truck arrived to remove what they claimed were unauthorized installations on his porch, and utility services were abruptly cut off. The chaos was orchestrated to send a clear message. Ethan's defiance would no longer be tolerated. Kerren emerged amid the clamor, her arms crossed and her face set in a mask of cold determination. "We are only doing what's necessary to preserve the neighborhood standards," she declared to a bewildered Ethan as inspectors circled, clipboards in hand. The machinery roared as it disrupted the familiar tranquility of Ethan's home, a place that had been his sanctuary for years. But rather than succumb to the intimidation, Ethan saw this as the tipping point. In a decisive moment of resolve, he called an emergency neighborhood meeting at his own home. With the utilities lights dimming outside and the roar of heavy equipment in the distance, Ethan's front door opened to a throng of concerned residents. They arrived not as passive bystanders, but as individuals ready to reclaim their community from the stranglehold of an overreaching HOA. Standing before his gathered neighbors, Ethan calmly presented a dossier of legal documents, photographs of the disruptive machinery, and official notices that revealed the complete lack of authority for such actions. "This," he said, "is not about aesthetics or outdated regulations. It's about your rights as homeowners and the sanctity of our community." His words, imbued with both personal passion and undeniable logic, resonated with the assembled crowd. Kerren, present at the meeting in person, watched from the back with growing indignation. She attempted to interject, insisting that the HOA's actions were legal and in the best interest of the neighborhood. Yet, as Ethan systematically exposed every misstep and every baseless claim, murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Homeowners who had once remained silent now found their voices, questioning the legitimacy of Kerren's edicts and the true purpose behind the sudden, drastic measures. During the heated exchange, Ethan revealed the most damning piece of evidence yet, a video recording from one of his security cameras capturing an HOA official admitting, in a hushed tone, that the towing order was nothing more than a power play. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on everyone present. Eyes that had once been fixed on Kerren now turned to her with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. Outside, as the sounds of disruption continued, the tide of public opinion had clearly shifted. A once tightly controlled HOA was beginning to show signs of internal fracture. Board members who had once rallied behind Kerren now exchanged uncertain looks, while others openly questioned the ethical and legal foundations of their decisions. In that moment, the community realized that Kerren's extremism was not a mandate for order. It was a symbol of personal ambition and corruption. Kerren's fury was palpable as the meeting wound down. Despite her attempts to maintain control, she could no longer hide behind the veneer of authority. Ethan, standing tall amidst the chaos, left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. The community, emboldened by the truth and united in defiance, was ready to take a stand against the injustice that had seeped into every corner of their neighborhood. That night, as Ethan reconnected the power to his home and restored the familiar hum of life around his barn, he couldn't help but smile. The HOA's overreach had forced his hand, and in doing so, had awakened a spirit of resistance in the community. Kerren might have thought that shutting down utilities and tearing up property would silence him, but it had only ignited a spark that would soon become an uncontrollable blaze of justice and collective empowerment. When all seemed to be turning in Ethan's favor, Kerren resorted to one final act of desperation. Determined to reassert her control over the neighborhood, she organized an aggressive campaign that blurred the lines between legality and intimidation. In the early hours of a cool winter morning, Kerren dialed the local police station, reporting a public disturbance at Ethan's property, this time citing his infamous porch lights as a threat to public safety. The police arrived in full force, their blue lights flashing against the dark sky. Ethan, prepared for any eventuality, greeted the officers calmly as they inspected his property. With his city official badge discreetly tucked into his jacket, he stood by as Kerren loudly accused him of disrupting the peace. "Your lights are too bright, causing confusion and endangering our neighbors," Kerren declared, her voice trembling with both anger and fear of losing control. But as the officers listened to her frantic claims, Ethan calmly produced a detailed report on the approved lighting standards for the area, along with photographic evidence and testimonies from neighbors who appreciated the warm glow that symbolized community comfort rather than chaos. It was a masterful display of preparedness, a rebuttal to Kerren's desperate move. When one officer raised an eyebrow at Kerren's exaggerated claims, her face flushed with indignation. A subtle shift occurred in the room. The officers, recognizing the absurdity of the situation, exchanged looks that said much without a word. Not one to admit defeat, Kerren then enlisted the services of a private investigator. Late one night, while reviewing security footage in his modest study, Ethan noticed something alarming. The private investigator was caught red-handed, creeping around his garage and rifling through personal documents. The next morning, with the clarity of dawn and the determination of a man with nothing left to lose, Ethan gathered all his evidence and prepared for his next move. At the next HOA meeting, now already a battleground of public opinion, Ethan played the damning security footage for the entire neighborhood. The grainy video showed the investigator skulking about, a clear breach of privacy, and an illegal act that further underscored the extent of Kerren's desperation. As the footage played, gasps and murmurs filled the room. The evidence was irrefutable. Kerren had not only abused her power, but had now stooped to orchestrating criminal behavior to undermine Ethan's credibility and to force his submission. Kerren's face turned ashen as the video played. She stammered excuses and attempted to downplay the incident, but the room's reaction was unanimous. Homeowners who had once been indifferent were now outraged by the lengths Kerren was willing to go to maintain her stranglehold over the community. The private investigator's actions, now documented and witnessed by all, sealed her fate in the eyes of the assembled residents. The fallout was swift. The police, having reviewed the security footage later that day, launched an investigation into the illegal trespassing and harassment. Kerren's desperate move had backfired spectacularly. What was meant to be a demonstration of her power instead exposed her willingness to commit crimes. For Ethan, it was the final nail in the coffin of Kerren's overreaching authority. As the meeting drew to a close, the atmosphere in the room was charged with a mixture of vindication and anticipation. Ethan's calm, methodical approach had not only deflected Kerren's final desperate move, but had also laid bare the corruption that had festered within the HOA. The evidence was clear, the community was unified, and Kerren's credibility had been irrevocably shattered. That night, as Ethan walked back to his barn, the cold air carrying the distant echoes of police sirens, he felt a deep sense of relief. Kerren's final gambit had not only failed, it had exposed her for what she truly was, an entitled bully desperate to cling to power. And in that moment, as the stars emerged in the night sky, Ethan knew that justice was finally within reach. The tide of change had become irresistible. In the wake of Kerren's public humiliation and the overwhelming evidence against her, the community rallied like never before. At a special emergency meeting, the residents convened to discuss the future of their once respected HOA. The atmosphere was electric, a blend of righteous indignation and hope for a fresh start. In that meeting, it was made clear, Kerren's days in power were over. A motion was swiftly introduced to remove Kerren from her position as HOA president. The vote, which passed with overwhelming support, was the culmination of months of pent-up frustration and a growing desire for transparency and fairness. The once feared enforcer of arbitrary rules now found herself facing a community united against her. With no viable allies left on the board, and under mounting pressure from local authorities already investigating her actions, Kerren was forced to resign in disgrace. In the days that followed, the domino effect of her downfall spread quickly. The HOA, which had long operated under the shadow of Kerren's authoritarian rule, began to collapse from within. Long-hidden financial irregularities were exposed, leading to a full-scale audit of the board's activities. Fines and penalties levied against the association for illegal enforcement and misappropriation of funds became headline news in the local press. Neighbors, emboldened by their victory, even joined forces to file a class action lawsuit against the HOA for its corrupt practices. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. While he had never sought personal glory, watching the oppressive regime crumble before his eyes was a triumph for the entire community. Sitting on his now fully restored porch, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction as he sipped his morning coffee. The soft glow of the sunrise reflected off the newly repaired barn, symbolizing not just the preservation of the past, but also the promise of a fair future. In contrast, Kerren's fate took a swift downward spiral, with the community turning against her and legal investigations intensifying. Her personal assets were soon frozen. Rumors began circulating that her once meticulously maintained home was to be sold, and whispers of further legal actions followed. Her reputation, once built on the veneer of strict adherence to rules, had now been irreparably tarnished. At the final HOA meeting, where her resignation was confirmed, Kerren's expression was a mix of bitterness and disbelief. In a last-ditch effort, she tried to deflect responsibility, claiming that she had been misinterpreted and that her actions were for the benefit of the community. But the evidence and the overwhelming sentiment of the homeowners left no room for debate. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to not only remove Kerren, but also to dissolve the current board and start afresh with a community-led initiative. The downfall of the HOA and the collapse of Kerren's regime marked a turning point. The community began to rebuild, not just their association, but the very trust and spirit that had been eroded by months of fear and manipulation. With new leadership elected from among the residents, the neighborhood embraced transparency, accountability, and a shared commitment to the well-being of every homeowner. For Ethan, the victory was personal. It wasn't just about a barn or even about one corrupt official. It was about reclaiming the right to live freely, with dignity and respect. As he looked out over his property, the barn standing proudly against the horizon, he knew that the future held the promise of genuine community spirit. The era of entitlement had ended, and in its place had arisen a movement grounded in fairness, unity, and the belief that no single person should have the power to dictate the lives of many. In the aftermath of Kerren's dramatic downfall, the full force of the law descended on the remnants of the HOA. Local authorities, buoyed by the community's outcry and armed with compelling evidence, launched a series of investigations that revealed a litany of legal violations. The association was slapped with heavy fines for enforcing non-existent rules, misappropriating funds, and subjecting homeowners to unwarranted harassment. Ethan, ever the voice of reason and determination, helped organize a class action lawsuit against the HOA. Together with his neighbors, he assembled a formidable case that not only highlighted the corruption of Kerren's era, but also demanded accountability from every board member complicit in the abuse of power. As legal proceedings commenced, news outlets began reporting on the scandal, a story of entitlement, injustice, and a community's fight for its rights. The court's decision, when it finally arrived, was a resounding victory for the homeowners. The HOA was ordered to pay substantial damages, and several board members faced criminal charges for their roles in the elaborate scheme of fraud and intimidation. In a final display of authority, the judge commended the homeowners for standing up to corruption and affirmed that no individual or group was above the law. For Ethan, the legal resolution was not just a personal triumph, but a turning point for the community. His steadfast commitment to truth had not only dismantled the corrupt system, but also paved the way for a new era of transparency. The once feared HOA was now a cautionary tale, its downfall a stark reminder of the power of community solidarity. In the months that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. Legal proceedings continued to unearth further irregularities, ensuring that those responsible for the abuse of power would be held accountable. Ethan's final power move, organizing the class action lawsuit, had set a precedent that rippled far beyond the borders of their once troubled community. As the legal and public repercussions mounted, Kerren's personal life began to unravel in tandem with her professional collapse. No longer the untouchable figure of authority, she was forced to confront the stark reality of her actions. Once known for her impeccably maintained appearance and commanding presence, Kerren now found herself the subject of public ridicule. News of her unethical practices spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. Local gossip, amplified by social media, painted a vivid picture of a woman who had sacrificed personal integrity for the sake of power. Her personal assets were scrutinized, her bank accounts frozen, and her meticulously curated lifestyle crumbled. Even her family life suffered. Rumors circulated that her husband, long accustomed to her relentless pursuit of authority, had grown weary of the endless scandals, and whispers of divorce began to surface. In one particularly humiliating episode, Kerren was spotted arguing with city officials at a public forum, desperately trying to justify her actions while the crowd looked on with a mixture of disbelief and scorn. Her attempts to salvage her reputation only deepened the sense of poetic justice that had enveloped her downfall. Meanwhile, Ethan's quiet satisfaction was tempered by the realization that justice, though served, came at the cost of witnessing the complete deconstruction of a once formidable adversary. Kerren's personal collapse reached its zenith when she was forced to vacate her home, a residence that had once symbolized her authority. With her belongings hastily packed and her reputation in tatters, she was seen leaving the neighborhood in a cab, the last vestiges of her power swept away by the winds of change. For many, it was a fitting end to a saga of entitlement run amok. For Ethan, it was a moment of bittersweet victory, a reminder that standing up against corruption might win battles, but it also left scars that lingered long after the fight was over. In the weeks and months that followed Kerren's departure, the neighborhood slowly but surely began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere that had once shrouded the community gave way to a newfound sense of freedom and unity. With the corrupt regime dismantled and the HOA's dark legacy laid bare, residents rediscovered the joys of a community built on mutual respect and shared values. Ethan Carter, whose steadfast resolve had been the catalyst for change, became an emblem of hope and resilience. Neighbors would often gather on his porch, now a symbol of both victory and history, and reminisce about the days when entitlement ruled. Laughter, long suppressed under the weight of arbitrary fines and endless rules, now filled the air. In a final playful twist of poetic justice, someone even jokingly presented Ethan with an HOA violation notice for the excessive brightness of his celebratory porch lights. He merely grinned and replied, "You really tried." As the community embraced its fresh start, the lessons of the past lingered as a reminder that no one should ever be allowed to wield power without accountability. The new board, elected from among the residents, prioritized transparency, fairness, and the preservation of the neighborhood's true character over any rigid, outdated rules. The era of Kerren and her entitled entourage was gone, replaced by a movement dedicated to rebuilding trust and fostering genuine community spirit. In the soft glow of a peaceful sunset, Ethan sat on his porch, his eyes drifting over the horizon where the old barn stood proud. It was more than a building. It was a monument to perseverance, to the victory of the collective over individual tyranny. Neighbors strolled by, exchanging warm greetings and sharing memories of battles fought and won. Even the very air seemed to hum with a promise of better days, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are those fought for one's home and heart. With a final, contented sigh, Ethan leaned back in his chair. The past had been exorcised, the future reclaimed. The legacy of entitlement was but a faded chapter in the annals of the community's history, replaced by a story of resilience, unity, and the unyielding belief that when people come together, even the most formidable tyrant can be toppled. Fade to black.